Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. We'll be starting momentarily. We'll give about 30 seconds for everyone to log in.
Chris, I want you to know that I dressed up for this webinar.
I can tell.
Put on my fancy black t-shirt.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm sure everybody appreciates that.
Yeah, this isn't an everyday kind of black t-shirt event. This is fancy.
The special black t-shirt.
Yeah, it's the kind of stuff that Andre 3000 from Outkast would wear, you know, on a night out. That's what I'm going for. If you're wondering, he's the pinnacle of fashion, male fashion. So
I do know who he is. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just saying he's
pushing the boundaries.
Super important. Super important. I have a good Andre 3000 story for another day.
Oh, I would love
another webinar, Cody. Yeah.
We can work it in at the end if there's time.
Let's see if there isn't like a natural segue to that.
Yeah.
I'll try to make it work.
That should be a goal for all of our webinars.
Mm-hmm.
All right, it looks like we have a good quorum going, so I'm sure folks will continue joining, but we're around 100 attendees at this point. So I'll go ahead and introduce us. So thank you for joining today's webinar, How to Simultaneously Run and Reinvent Your Business. My name is Cody Hansen. I'm a Senior Marketing Manager at Singularity University, and I have the privilege of moderating and running the Q&A for today's webinar. Today we'll hear from Chris, co-founder and Chief Learning and Innovation Officer at Singularity U Nordic, as well as Kyle, Executive Vice President of the Uncommon Partners Lab at Singularity University. This webinar explores insights from Chris's latest book, Transforming Legacy Organizations, which provides real-world advice and research-based information on how to grow innovation by employing new technologies, improving processes, and establishing a culture of creativity and forward momentum. If you have questions while Chris and Kyle are speaking, please use the Q&A button to type your question. I will curate them and we'll take time at the end to answer as many questions as possible. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Chris.
Thanks a lot, Cody, and thanks so much for putting this on, and thanks everyone who's joining also via the link and watching it a little bit later. I'm happy to talk a little bit about the core content of my book, Transforming Legacy Organizations, which is really what the title here says, is about how you as a big company can simultaneously both run and reinvent your business. And the thing is, when it comes to innovation and larger, more established companies, I like to say there really is good news and bad news, because the thing is that innovation for the larger companies of the world is much harder than it is for startups, because their worlds are much more complex. The good news, however, is that no one really has a better chance of succeeding with their innovation initiatives than the large established companies do, because they have all the resources, they have money, they have data, they have customers, they have talent, infrastructure, the works. The startups, they have almost none of that. So really what it comes down to in the end is much more about mindset and about design. And that's what I want to speak about, and also loop Kyle in a little bit and learn from his experiences on that. And speaking about mindset, I actually want to start here. So what the picture you're seeing here is a picture of what a space elevator might look like. And a space elevator is exactly what it says it is, right? It's an elevator that goes from Earth and thousands of kilometers out into space. And it's been a theory to build those for more than 100 years, and it was repopularized in 1980 by Arthur C. Clarke. You see the cover of his book, The Fountains of Paradise here, which was published in 1980. And in that book, he explores the near future where human beings are building space elevators that transports materials and human beings 36,000 kilometers out into space. And he won the Hugo Award for this book, which is the most prestigious award you can get for writing sci-fi novels. And when he got the award, all the journalists in the room, they asked him and said, "So Arthur, when do you think we will actually have space elevators in real life?" And he said, "Well, probably around 50 years after they all stop laughing." Just like they laughed at this guy, you know him, Alexander Graham Bell, inventing the functioning telephone, which he tried to sell the patent to Western Union for $100,000, and they weren't interested. Or they laughed at this guy. This is George Baird, and what you see is a picture of the first television set. And the radio pioneers said, well, that's way too impractical. And of course they were right? This was version 1.0. But as I'm sure you're well aware, and as is a big part of what we talk about and research and investigate here at Singularity University, is that accelerating pace of change due to technological developments means that we can no longer afford to have a mindset like that. And even though we still do to a large extent in our larger established companies, and a lot of it has to do with what you could call the immune system. And the immune system is a term that's been popular here in Silicon Valley for a number of years, being used to describe the large old companies who cannot innovate. And while researching for writing this book, what really also struck me was how much finger pointing there was going on when talking about the immune system, right? This top management pointing to middle management saying they don't want to innovate, and the middle managers pointed to the employees, and the employees pointed back up the chain of command. But really, pointing fingers is too lazy and too simplistic a way to try and describe the barriers towards innovation in large companies, because of course there's human resistance to change. It's a real thing, but I would argue it's not the most important thing. And what we need to understand when we talk about the immune system really is that it has multiple layers, and we can explore and talk about both the individual, the organizational, and the societal immune system. I'll give you just a short version of it here. So yes, of course, there's human resistance to change. That has partly to do with our personality profiles. Now, some of us like to bungee jump, some of us prefer to stay at home on the couch and watch Netflix, right? That's neither good nor bad, we're just different. We have different risk profiles. That, however, is important when we are to embark upon innovation journeys or digital transformation projects, etc., etc. Not everyone is equally prone to want to join something new. We also have psychological resistance. The human brain has a lot of biases. One of them is the status quo bias, which means that we would rather not lose than win. Again, that means that if we are to embark upon journeys of uncertainty, it needs to be pretty compelling to get us to go along. And then finally, there's also a capability deficit in our organizations and in our employees. In fact, there's a recent global study with more than 2,000 managers, with 76% of them said that they do not have the capability in-house they need to move into the future. Now, so if that is the fact, and if we as human beings in the organizations feel we don't have the capabilities, of course we will have resistance towards the new. So yes, human resistance to change is a real thing. But again, I would argue it's not the most important thing, because even more important than that is the organizational immune system. That is constructed of our KPIs and reward systems, our key performance indicators. And in general, when we look at companies, KPIs are a mess. Another large global study with more than 3,000 managers showed that only 26% felt that their KPIs were actually aligned to a large degree with corporate strategy. And I'm sure I'm not the only one who's experienced in larger companies that different silos actually have KPIs that mean that they're not able to actually move in the same direction. So IT typically has KPIs about becoming more efficient, where sales and marketing, they need to become even more customer-centric and be able to individualize, etc. And very often those things actually move in different directions, but they're being measured on those two things. And that creates what we in game theory call a construction problem. Right? They are literally not able to move in the same direction. And nevertheless, there's a tendency to disregard or not pay enough attention to this in our larger companies. And I think it's primarily because it's simply so complex. Like KPIs are sort of a monster that is really, really difficult for us to understand. I'll get back a little bit to how to think about this. In the organizational immune system, of course, I alluded to it, there's also your legacy IT infrastructure, processes, business models, etc. Should new ideas and endeavors, should they be compliant with IT? Well, perhaps they should, but perhaps they shouldn't. That depends on what we're trying to achieve. And I'll get back to why that is important and why we need to think about innovation in multiple tracks at the same time. And finally, of course, we have investors and shareholders. And if you are not a Silicon Valley company or the Netflixes and Amazons of the world that can go years and years with billion-dollar deficits because they're playing a different long game than most companies, well, then you have investors and shareholders that demand returns really, really fast. And that, of course, also puts a strain on the company. Now, so I would argue if you take the organizational immune system and the individual immune system and put them up against each other, the organizational immune system is much more powerful. And that means that if you do not change the system when you are embarking on digital transformation or something other, it doesn't matter what the individual will. The system will always beat out the individual. So therefore, if we are to change, we need to change the system. Human beings are actually remarkably adaptable to change if they have the right context to do it within. And finally, there's the societal immune system, which has to do with legislation, very often a prime barrier for developments, not what we are able to do technologically, as is legacy customers and providers. And if you're the big one in the market, then you need to help your customers and providers along with the journey, because a world full of SMEs, they typically don't have the awareness and the resources to actually digitize as well. And finally, of course, there's an economic climate. Now, all of this we need to factor in as organizations in order to really be able to design against the barriers that can hold back innovation in our organizations. And why is innovation harder in the large companies? Well, because their worlds are much more complex. And therefore, they also need to think about innovation as not one thing, but actually conduct innovation in multiple tracks at the same time. That depends on how close to the existing core it is what we're trying to achieve and the scope of what we're trying to achieve. So track number one, I call it optimizing innovations. You see the icon here, it's the metaphorical extra blade on the razor. So when the razor manufacturer announces that they now not have 3 blades but 4 blades, and a year and a half later they don't have 4 blades, they have 5 blades, that's an optimizing innovation. Now, in itself, it's good and right. I mean, you should constantly look towards how to optimize, and the majority of your company is working on this, as they should. This pays rent, right? That's important. The problem is that it's only for the short term, because what you're inherently doing is improving upon the past. You also need to prepare for the future, and you need to invent the future. Preparing for the future is what you do with augmenting innovations. That's where you upgrade your existing core. That's where companies go from analog to digital, or when they needed to become mobile first, or now the big companies are talking about becoming AI first. And pretty soon, maybe we need to be quantum first, and that will continue. There will always be new technologies we need to be able to leverage in order to become more efficient and create more customer value. And finally, we need to invent the future, and that is what I call mutating innovations. That is where we conduct a much more radical experiments. And the difference here is substantial between augmenting and mutating innovations, because in augmenting innovations, you're upgrading your core. In mutating innovations, you are challenging the core. That demands different types of people and also a different design. So let me give you a couple of examples before I will talk to Kyle and take your questions as well. Augmenting innovations. What can be helpful to think about some of the tools to help augment the existing core is to build Trojan horses for yourself. Now, a Trojan horse, for instance, is a center of excellence. So what happens very often in large companies is that whatever the buzzword is, and the past 2-3 years, the number one buzzword, of course, has been AI. So everybody's thinking about AI, and that means that you start to see a lot of different endeavors in the organization where a lot of people are working on AI. And while that shows entrepreneurship and innovation desires, what it also means is that there are too many fragmented initiatives where probably the right people are not working on the right problems. So creating a center of excellence is a way to actually focus all that energy into what is really important to explore. And it also enables you to actually attract the right talents to work in that center of excellence, to work on those problems, because there are not a lot of AI experts out there. And I saw a survey recently that suggested that 41% of all AI experts are being hired by Amazon. Well, that leaves 59% to the rest of the world, right? So it's in really short demand, so we need to be able to create compelling jobs for these people. Now, creating internal accelerators is a way to build a Trojan horse for yourself. And there are other tools for this. And we see more and more of the larger companies doing this, and which is as they should. And even when they do it, it still remains really, really difficult. And the reason for this has less to do with technology and more to do with culture. And that's because of this. Now, so there's really, really interesting study conducted over more than 10 years by the social scientists George Land and Beth Jarman. They did it for NASA, actually. And what they did was that they investigated in children and adults their ability for divergent thinking. Divergent thinking is the ability to have truly original ideas. So they took 1,600 children and a control group of 280,000 people. And in the 1,600 children at the age of 4 to 5, they found that 98% of them could be labeled as creative geniuses. In the adult control group, it was 2%. And perhaps even more interestingly, by 8 to 10, it had dropped to 32%. By 15, it was down to 10%. So this shows us that our institutions, and primarily here our educational institutions, actively make us unlearn our inborn creative abilities, literally. But if we can unlearn them, then we can also relearn them. And that's what we need to do in a world of accelerating change. Because again, we have in our large companies these status quo cultures, rather not lose than win. What we need, however, are cultures inside the core full of incremental innovators. I define those as people who are comfortable with change within certain boundaries. So it's not radical innovators. We also need radical innovators, but you cannot have a company only full of radical innovators, because that's chaos and anarchy. What you want to do is you want to try and find them, and then you want to put them into the right projects, typically the ones that are about mutating innovation. But we need the incremental innovators inside the core, and we all need to be those. We all need to be comfortable with change within the boundaries and the safety net that we have in our larger companies. And a way to think about this is to create culture hacks in the organization that can help transform culture. And a way to think about this really is similar to when you think about having a music stereo. So you can play music, and you can turn up the volume, but you can also adjust the treble, the bass, and the balance, and that helps you create a bigger and better music experience. You can think about developing your culture in the same way and saying, we have innovation culture, we want to build it, and we have actually 3 levers: our scenes, our processes, and our agents that can help us optimize and transform and create a stronger culture. Scenes is everything we can see, hear, feel, touch, smell. It's our physical environments, it's our digital tools. Processes is the way we work, and the tools that we're using, and agents is how we interact. We used to call it people, but of course we can't do that anymore because we are increasingly interacting with artificial intelligence as well. Now, a couple of examples on this. Now, I hope none of you who are part of this webinar work in an office environment that looks like this. That is sort of your traditional cubicle office environment. But researching for the book, it really struck me how many low-hanging fruits there are if you design your physical workspace in the right way to optimize productivity, happiness at work, and also creativity. So in fact, if you design offices so that you not only have the all open office environments, which are very popular but typically not good for anything other than light conversation and coffee, you also need to have space where you can focus in and space where you can meet people randomly, etc. But if you have colors, if you have art on the walls, if you have plants, etc., that actually actively engages the human brain, sparks our curiosity, and thus makes us more creative. And if you also let people design their own office environments, that actually makes them feel much more safe and comfortable and at home. And safety is inherently important when it comes to innovation, because innovation is risky. Now, so if you design for this, there are a lot of low-hanging fruits to actually optimize a lot in both terms of creativity and productivity in your organization. And then back to the KPIs. Now, KPIs create process in the organization. And I find that what we tend to do too much in our large big companies is that we sort of take the deceptive shortcuts, which is we define a target to create a result, right? We want to sell more of X, so that's the KPI, how much do you sell? But actually, there's a lot of value in what you could call the transformative long game, which is where we define targets, but we do that to set culture and impact mindsets and thus create results. And we see more companies actually starting to do this. A couple of examples is Google, who have KPIs around thought leadership, or Microsoft, that used to be very cutthroat on sales, now actually also has KPIs on how their employees share knowledge and find new ways to work. And Danish water pump manufacturer that has recently created some new digital endeavors, they take those employees and also create KPIs on collaboration and commitment to the project. And those KPIs are much more qualitative than what we typically see. But what they do is they create awareness, they set direction for people, and then enable everyone in the organization to have conversations on that. And that sets culture, that impacts mindset, and ultimately enables results for the long term in a better way. And we will see much more of this, I'm sure. And my final example on culture hacks here is from Google. And what you see here is the picture of penguins jumping from an iceberg into the water. And in parts of Google, they have created what they call the Courageous Penguin Award. Now, so of course, what happens is that when you as a penguin, you stand on the border of the iceberg, someone has to jump first. And the problem is that the one who jumps first doesn't know whether it will hit ice or it will hit water. So someone has to be the courageous one. And if it hits water, well, then everybody else will follow. So what they do here at Google is that they have created the Courageous Penguin Award, that they award to the one who jumps first. It's not about the result that's being created, but it's about actually daring to do it, not knowing what the result will be, because that sets culture. That's a little hack. I mean, it's pretty simple. It doesn't cost anything, but it speaks volumes about the type of culture you're trying to create. And we need many more courageous penguins in our companies, because this used to be the low risk model. Cut costs, buy back shares to increase return on invested capital, but increasingly it's becoming the high risk one, because the demand on innovation power in the big companies is increasing. And this is the real innovation funnel here, right? It's going from 3,000 raw ideas to exploring 300 to setting up 125 small projects, 9 significant ones, 4 major developments, 1.7 launches to create one hit. It's not about one big bet. It's about many different initiatives to explore and find out what will actually be the next big thing for us. And probably the company that understands this best and really has it built into its core is Amazon. And just a quick and simple example of how they work on this is, them, of course, starting selling physical books online. Mid-2000, they created the Kindle, designed to disrupt the physical book, which of course didn't happen, right? I believe the customer experience wasn't and still isn't good enough compared to a physical book, but it was still a large hit for them. And compared with other digital endeavors, it meant their need for data storage increased dramatically. So they created Amazon Web Services. Originally an internal service, now it puts $17.5 billion on their bottom line. This is the reason that they're making money, which increased their need for data storage and data centers and energy. So they created Amazon Wind Farms. Just built a $400 million wind farm in Texas that also powers 90,000 private homes. So now they're in the energy sector. And with Amazon, you can easily come up with 5, 6, 7, or 8 other mutations of what the core of the organization used to be. And that is how we increasingly need to look upon ourselves as organizations when it comes to the mutating innovations. We need to conduct more radical experiments where we challenge our cores to see what we might mutate into in the future, because if we want to be as or more successful in the future, then the core of who we are will need to mutate. Now, logistics giant Maersk is an interesting example of this. They've been struggling for a number of years now, but what they just created here is an example of a potentially mutating innovation. We don't know if it will be successful yet. It's too early to say. But they had actually created an internal project where they were exploring to build a logistics sales platform on blockchain technologies, but it was sort of withering, didn't get the right attention. So what they did was that they took this project and they moved it away from the core, what you should do with these types of more radical experiments, where you need whole new sets of capabilities and technologies and business models, and build a new company together with IBM called TradeLens, that they have now launched and are testing out. And there are other companies who are working on the same thing, but if they are successful with this at Maersk, that might actually be what mutates their core into the logistics company of the future. And finally, I want to just share with you the idea of radical open innovation via, for instance, X Prizes. So X Prizes are large global competitions. The first one was conducted more than 10 years ago about building a manned rocket, sending it into the stratosphere twice within 2 weeks. And the winners won $10 million, was bought by Richard Branson. He created Virgin Galactic out of it, and it kickstarted commercial spaceflight. Now there are a bunch of these X Prizes around. The newest one is called the Avatar X Prize. And this is the task that right now hundreds of teams are either applying to or trying to solve. is to create limitless travel by teleporting your consciousness into a physical avatar body that will enable people to instantly be in multiple places at once, literally. Now, that's a daunting task, but there are right now hundreds of teams either applying or have been accepted to try and solve this. What you see here is an early prototype, so not what it's going to be, but you see virtual reality glasses, gloves with haptics, and a physical robot in the other end. But for the discussion about corporate innovation here, what I find most interesting is the sponsor of this, ANA, Japan's #1 airline. Because right now, ANA, Japan's #1 airline, are conducting a radical experiment on a potential future where human beings' preferred means of transportation over longer distances is not flying, the core of what they are doing today. They're spending, I think it's about $22 million on this, but really when you think about it, it's peanuts compared to the R&D value they get out of it. And I believe that the return on investment for X Prize, depending on the price, is somewhere between 10 and 20 to the dollar that you're investing. And the people who are trying to solve this problem, you couldn't even hire them if you wanted to, right? Because in this case, they don't want to work for an airline. They want to solve an interesting problem. So a question we all need to ask ourselves is, what is our X Prize? What are the experiments we're conducting that are challenging the core? And even though we don't know what it will turn out to be, and we don't really understand the technologies and the implications right now, we need to investigate it in order to also build for the long-term future. Which brings us back to the space elevator. And you remember they asked Arthur C. Clarke, when will we have him? And he said, probably 50 years after they stop laughing. Well, the race is on. Right now, the Shizuoka University of Japan and JAXA, the Japanese NASA, are actually getting ready to experiment with building a very small space elevator. It's 3 times 3 times 6 centimeters. They're going to deploy it on a 10-meter cable between 2 mini satellites. But if they're successful with doing this, they will in fact have proof of concept that space elevators are viable and a real thing. So regardless of how ridiculous or far out things seem in the beginning, we really need to stop laughing and get cracking. And with that, I would like to also invite you into the conversation here, Carl, because all the stuff that I've been speaking about here, you've been living and working on for many years, also in huge big corporations, and also dive into it in your own book, Leading Transformations. So I would love to hear also some of your thoughts around these topics of innovation in the big companies.
Yeah. I'm sorry, but I'm going to turn the tables on you, Chris, and ask you a question if that's okay first, and then I can jump in. So one of the things that I've seen in my career, and then also you lay out very well in your book, is that the new technologies are actually only successful if you use the old technologies, which are like human stuff, right? So like X Prize is a good example. The reason why X Prize works is because it uses an old human thing called incentive-based competition, right? Which, if you read any of Peter's work, talks about, the Spirit of St. Louis and all that, but that's been going on for thousands of years. It didn't start with the Spirit of St. Louis. What are some of those old technologies, those old human things that we should be looking at, like competition, like open source competition, and other things that large organizations just miss?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's one of the reasons that I put so much emphasis on talking about KPIs and reward systems as really core to the barriers that we experience in the organizational immune system of organizations. And that somehow is overlooked, I feel, to a very large degree in organizations, is that what are we incentivizing? And the notion of how easy it is to point fingers, but it's never really the right answer to do that. And I mean, I have a background as a market researcher, and to me, whatever I look at, any problem I see, it always boils down to human motivation. What makes people do stuff? What makes them not do stuff? And that comes down to incentives, right? And so what we really need to understand human psychology much better, also at large scale. And of course, that's super duper complicated because we have these big companies with so much going on, but we need to simplify, I think, how we measure and evaluate each other, and how we use measurements towards achieving certain goals. and we need to make it much more transparent, and we need to ensure that we are aligned across divisions and silos, etc., in organizations. I really feel that's at the core of any type of innovation. If you can do that, I mean, then everything else will follow from it. I don't know what your thoughts and experiments are.
No, 100%. I said that knowing you very well and knowing that that is the core of what you address. And I would say the other thing too is stories, right? How important stories are, right? We're dealing with all of these big legacy organization problems. And, you know, I know that you and I are kindred spirits in this regard, where I always felt like when I was working at big companies that we were always kind of, you know, you work for a big boring company. What you really, good luck, little buddy, you know, on doing anything important. It's going to be up to the tech companies and the startups to do all the cool stuff, which is clearly not true, right? And if you look up all the potential opportunity and all of the capability, it's all locked up inside of our larger organizations, especially the older organizations. So I love your book and I love what you're doing here. I think the one thing that I'm very passionate about, and I think that weaves throughout everything, is storytelling. You know, what is the story that we have? Where are we going? And if we're missing that, that's when everything falls apart, right? People will do all kinds of wild and crazy things. If they are able to understand what they're doing ladders up to something bigger than themselves, and that something bigger is positive, right? There's this apocryphal story, I think. I don't think it's actually real, but illustrates my point of how important storytelling and what I would call a strategic narrative is. You know, after President Kennedy gave his famous moonshot speech, he said he was touring various facilities, NASA facilities, and once again, this might be apocryphal, probably is, but I stopped to chat with a janitor who was sweeping or mopping or something at the time, and said, "Sir, what are you doing here?" And he said, "Mr. President, I'm helping to put a man on the moon." And, you know, real or not, that story does illustrate exactly what is missing in a lot of our organizations. Like, to your point, the KPIs, in my view, are symptomatic of missing like there's a mismatch on what we're trying to do, right? And that's what's really critical. Chris, can you hear me?
Yeah, I hear you. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. The other thing that's really interesting, I think, and you lay this out very well, it's just, we just have to constantly be mutating and evolving. And some of those mutations will work out and be suited for the environments to which they're in, and some won't. But it doesn't mean that you stop mutating and stop evolving. And the other part of it is, so much of it, when an organization tried something once and it didn't work out, they will use that as a stick to beat anybody who dares suggest that you try something new again. And so just understanding it and identifying that is critical, because then you can continue to move on and just say, yes, I hear you. We're going to learn from that, but we're not going to stop mutating. We're not going to stop evolving. So I love that. And I highly recommend, obviously I'm on this webinar. Chris is a dear friend, but man, you should really read this book. It's an awesome book.
Thanks, man. I would actually also like to dive a little bit deeper into the notion of storytelling, because I think you're probably one of the people who has explored this and experimented with to the largest degree in the world, and also highly successfully. And I also use you as a case in the book, and obviously your own book, Leading Transformation, also explores this in depth, because it also points back to the whole notion of incentivizing and motivating us towards doing stuff. Would you share a little bit about how you have worked with the notion of really creating these? One is to sort of unlock the mind to actually explore the future, and then also all the way through the process and the presentation of it.
Yeah, so like you, Chris, I'm a recovering market researcher, classically trained marketing researcher, and spent my early part of my career doing that because I really just cared about why people make decisions. But when I was in graduate school, what I would do is I would study how people made decisions, but not just necessarily what they thought how they were making decisions, but what was actually going on behind the curtain. And what I found was, when you presented someone information that you could convince them bullet by bullet, basically, that they should do X. Usually it was around working out or eating better. No one's going to disagree with you. They're going to go, yeah, sure, I'm going to do that. But then they leave and they go eat like I went to graduate school in Wisconsin. So you had like cheese curds and chicken wings, like something like that. There's literally a sandwich called the heart attack. And so people would go there and those things were filled, right? And so there's clearly a mismatch between what we will agree to and we believe, and versus what we actually do. And so how do we break that? How do we, because we really do, when we say, yes, I agree, we really do believe that, but then our behavior gets in the way. So long story short, instead of presenting the information in bullets, if it was presented even in a story with characters and conflict and a narrative arc wasn't even fancy or even a good story, the likelihood that someone would change their behavior went up exponentially. It didn't matter what the topic was. And when you put EEG headsets on people and do MRIs, you can see that our brains just light up if you say, can I tell you a story? You don't even have to tell a story afterwards. Like, we are hardwired to love and receive stories. And so we will drag these stories into our work life. It's just really bizarre to me, and it was bizarre to me, that organizations don't create their own stories with real characters, conflict, and a narrative arc. You know, because when you start your first day in a new job, the first thing that they do is they give you the origin story of the organization. That is the first thing that they do. But then what's lost, and as the company gets bigger and bigger and bigger, they neglect to continue the story. You know, when you're a startup, you're still in the origin story. You're a part of this. We're trying to achieve X. It's a high degree of clarity, but very low certainty of how we do it. Just like the moonshot, we're going to go to the moon. I have no idea how we're going to do it. That's kind of what the startup is. As a company and organization evolves, the origin story gets further and further away, and it becomes more and more calcified. And they'll tell the origin story almost like they tell the story of how, you know, your grandfather's grandfather established this farm. Like, it becomes so far away. But if you can continue the story of not only why you're here now and doing what you're doing now, but then what you're going to become, that's when organizations really become powerful. And if you look at like what Satya Nadella and Microsoft has done, if you look and read what he does, he tells the story. And there's a real reason. I mean, he's an excellent CEO, no question about it. But he's always weaving in stories and showing how what they're doing is real. And you can see how when the story falls off, things fall apart. You know, the Steve Jobs, you know, Apple continued, Steve leaves, story kind of falls apart, things fall apart. And there's other reasons for that too, but anyone can build a story. That science has been around for a very long time. And as a leader in an organization, or as a person working in any organization, if you have not studied literary theory, just at a base level, you're missing out big time. So I would say, please read any Joseph Campbell book, and you will learn all kinds of allegories that would apply to your personal life and then also your life at work. So that's literally what we do. I hired science fiction writers, gave them all the research and trend data when I was at Lowe's, a big traditional home improvement company in the US. And from that, before AR, VR was even a thing, we were able to go down this long path, like you described, way before anybody else, and found all kinds of opportunities along the way. And Lowe's was named the most innovative company in AR and VR last year, not amongst retailers, but in the world, which makes no sense at all. Built stuff with Microsoft and Google and many, many others. Like, literally built stuff like, who would have ever thought that would happen? And it just goes back, for me, it's like, to transform legacy organization, if you can do that a little bit, it unlocks so much power and has the possibility of positively changing the world. And also, frankly, has the opportunity to just make a lot of money as well. And those things aren't mutually exclusive in my view. They are hand in hand. They need to be, that's the true sustainability there. But once again, it only comes from something that most people would think is soft skills. It's not AI, it's not this, it's the soft skills first, and then you can build on top of that.
And I think there's also an interesting thing in this is who does what, right? Because I talk about being incremental innovators versus being radical innovators. And well, the notion of there's some discussions, should everybody innovate or shouldn't everybody innovate? And I think that depends on how you define this stuff, because in my opinion, everybody inside the core needs to be, as I say, you know, comfortable with change and actively working within that. But it's not everybody who, you know, uncovers the moonshot or works with the moonshot and develops it, etc. So what's your experience here? And I mean, who gets involved in what when you talk about, for instance, the science fiction methodologies that you've been using?
So great question. When you're developing a core strategic document, and that's really what the story is, the core story, at the early stages, as few people as humanly possible. You know, if you get, you might have heard the joke that what's a camel designed by committee? It was supposed to be a horse. And so when you have too many people too many cooks in the kitchen, it gets weird and twisted and also really boring. So when you're trying to do something that's bigger, like to your point about Maersk and about IBM, like you have to leave sometimes physically in order to really be different. And so being intentional about that is incredibly important. And if you aren't willing to do that, then you're not really willing to go and really make the change. And this is the problem that I see a lot of times, is that a lot of companies will say, oh, I want to change, but I just want these 3 people to do the change for the entire organization. That's just not going to work, because it's got to be systemic. And then the other countervailing question that I get a lot is, how do I increase the culture of innovation in my organization? Which I also think is the wrong way. Because if you're just saying, oh, everyone's going to innovate, that means you've diffused responsibility on the big, hard, difficult, transformational moonshot stuff, and that's never going to happen. So to your point, Chris, you have to have both. People need to, that's why I love your idea of mutation. And even I would say before mutation, there's adaptation. So when you start, if you're an accountant, you should not be radically transforming your accounting principles, right? That's a bad thing, right? That's how you get to jail. But what you can do is find new and innovative ways of communicating. You can find new and innovative ways of doing your work in order to achieve your objectives. And so everyone has the mandate, in my view, and the necessity to innovate meaningfully within their sphere. Even if you're a single contributor, there's so much you can do by yourself, if you have no one else on your team, that you can meaningfully innovate and mutate. And if you're not doing it, you're missing out, because it's just not good for you, and it's not good for the organization you work for sure.
So I know, Cody, that there's also a bunch of questions from people who joined the webinar here. So perhaps we should dive a little bit into some of those as well.
Yeah, exactly. There are many questions coming in. They're all very good. So what I'll do is I'll read some of them off, and you two can toss them back and forth and decide how you want to answer them best. So one of the most recent ones here is, what is your take on exploring atypical partnerships, finding new sources of innovative ideas outside your core organization?
So if I'm starting here, I think it's absolutely core, and that's also why I spend a lot of time discussing this in the book. Because of the accelerating pace of change and the convergence, not just of technologies, but of industries, and the whole notion of which industry am I in or could I be in, and where are competitors coming from, and they're coming from all over the place now, right? It's simply too complicated. It's too complex. There's no way that you can be the expert on everything. Even the biggest, most successful companies in the world, even the most innovative ones, the Googles and Apples and etc., whatever they're called, they cannot do it fast enough, and they cannot do it well enough, and they cannot also attract all the right competencies. So that is why I love the notion of these radical open innovation competitions, for instance, like the X Prize, right? Because it sort of creates a whole different setup for how you can engage with people that you would otherwise never ever be able to reach, and really amplify the innovation power that is out there. So I mean, you need to play on all the horses, right? I mean, you need to really be much more open and think about incentive competitions, for instance, thinking about really getting to know and understand the startup landscape, both to get to know them, to invest in them, to buy them, to start using their technologies, creating innovation labs. I know you have I would guess a love-hate relationship with innovation labs, Kyle, but they can certainly have a lot of value. So it's incredibly important. Kyle?
Yeah, so I'm really passionate about this topic. I named my company Uncommon Partners for a reason. I haven't heard the term atypical partnership before. Maybe it's an off-brand company that I'm not aware of. Small joke. But yeah, so the whole phrase, which I think I coined years ago, was developed to be awkward on purpose so people would remember it, right? So uncommon, like anyone you wouldn't normally work with. If you say, like, for instance, like Lowe's helped put a 3D printer in the International Space Station, that really happened. It's up there right now. You can look at it right now on Google. If someone goes Lowe's, space, and they think that, or NASA, that's so weird, you're like, yep, you're on the right track, right? It should be kind of like, oh, that's a little bizarre. And then you're on the right track. The other is partnerships, which you really have to be a partner, right? So a partner tells you things that are uncomfortable because they are in it for the long haul. And that's really important. You know, your partner in your life, your spouse, your boyfriend, your girlfriend, they will say, honey, you look ridiculous with those pants on. No one else in your life is going to tell you that except for your mother, because they love you so much. And so for us, like when you have a partner, it's not a vendor-vendee relationship. You're going to say, you know, that person you just hired, I don't like them and they're hurting the project. Now, if this was a vendor-vendee relationship, I just wouldn't hire you again and you would never know why. And so we have to move away from those if you really want to have transformation with these uncommon partners. And if those two things are together, you can do incredible things. And the evidence, if you go throughout the course of history, every single time humans partner with uncommon partners in a true way, we get amazing things. The sad thing is it's usually under duress. We're usually in a state of war or some sort of terrible, terrible change. But hopefully we can start doing that before the aliens arrive, like what we learned from Will Smith in the first Independence Day.
All right, moving on. There were quite a few around this general topic. So can disruptive innovation happen away from the core, be performed within the organization, or is it advised to have dedicated resources for this who aren't limited by the established company procedures and the incremental result expectations?
Yeah, so I mean, if you talk about the disruptive innovation and sort of the Clayton Christensen definition of what it is, right? Then of course the big reason why it happens is because there simply are no incentives inside the core organization to go down that route, creating products of lesser quality that gives you less return and that may also be produced in different ways and have different business models, etc. That simply isn't aligned with all the properties inside the old organization. And so that is a lot of argumentation for why you want to put it on the edges, why you want to move it away from the core. It's way too noisy. It's really hard for anybody with P&L responsibility to see why they should put a big risk on something that doesn't seem to give them a lot of return in the beginning. And that is why the traditional disruptive company gets to do it for so long until anybody sort of realizes that they might actually be a real threat, right? I mean, so there's a lot of compelling data behind the notion that if you're really challenging your core, then it's way too noisy and the obstacles are really, really big to do that inside the organization. So your chances of success are much better if you move them to the side.
Yeah. Ditto. If you really want to have meaningful change, you have to have two things. You have to have a geographic distance, and you have to have kind of a kind of a vision distance. So the way I used to talk about it at Lowe's, which is you have to also still be tied to the core in some way, right? You can't just be off on your own without any tether towards reality. That's also just as bad. So the way it was structured for us was that we had the purpose of Lowe's was to help people love where they live. The purpose of my lab was to help people love where they live by seeding the future. So every single thing we were doing, we were just paving the path for the big train that was coming down the road. And so everything that we were doing did not have to be perfect right off the get-go because we were seeding. And that frame really, really helped. And I'm sad that it took me as long as it did to come up with this idea, because I would battle that. Initially, when I first started the lab, it was inside of the home office. And I just got sucked into every dumb meeting about every dumb thing. And because you become like the person who can fix stuff. And if you're fixing the core stuff, you're not working on everything else. And so just being really intentional about that makes a whole lot of difference. And then it allows for you also to change your culture a little bit and mutate a bit. So like, for instance, like if you like went into the lab, like most innovation labs or the corporate office, the dress code is different. The demographic is different. The way we talk is different. Like everything was a little bit different. And that's a good thing. And that distance allows for that so that we can experiment and have our own culture and do some things.
I think it's also interesting, Kyle, that the way that you set up, I mean, initially you were inside at Lowe's, you were inside the core, but then you moved away. But then I know also, uh, as you matured and sort of gained some successes, you actually also reestablished a presence inside the core, right? To sort of build a stronger bridge over there. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Exactly. So when I left, so it's like knowing your own system, right? So when I left, I made sure that there was a really strong leader from my team, who is now my co-founder, Amanda, who ran that shop at HQ, so I could leave. Because I'm like the partnership build stuff guy. And she's really, really capable of, she was the head of narrative. So she could actually build these narratives, and then also her team, which we call producers, would then be able to continue to work with all of the parts of the organization to keep things integrated and on strategy, work with legal, work with all that stuff. While my team out in Seattle, where we were doing all the building, we could be focused on the building and the partnerships, like with Google and Microsoft and others. And that really worked well. I did have to be on a plane a lot, going back and forth, but I lived in Seattle where the lab was, because that's where I felt like I needed to be. And then because I had a really strong leader in the corporate headquarters, I knew that was fine without me being there day to day. So all of this goes back into like I was going to say again, all of the old stuff that we know. You know, you have to have succession planning. You can't just have your innovation function wrapped around one very charismatic individual, which is what I see a lot, or someone who's very, very smart, or one great idea. It has to be a process that like you said, Chris, generates ideas that then allows for the sifting to happen and the editing and the revision to happen. If you don't have that process, you're going to be in a constant state of like, what are we going to do? And that's just how you get spun into obsolescence.
And I think also pointing to what you said, I mean, you cannot just cut the cord and go away and don't have any relationship with headquarters, which points to what I said in the very beginning. I mean, why do the big companies have a much bigger chance of succeeding? Well, because they have all the resources, right? Yep. So again, it's about the mindset and the design of it, because if you design it in the right way, then you really get the best of both worlds. And having that bridge that goes back to headquarters that can feed you with customers and data and whatever you need, not too much money, right? There's like something about that, but the customers, the data, the access, etc., just, amplifies the potential for success dramatically compared to if you're a startup that just comes from scratch.
Totally. I think the best analogy, I think, is you're an electron on the atom. So you have a loose bond, but you are out there, and you need the nucleus, but you're out there. And I think if you're too much part of the core, then not good stuff. But if you're too far away, then you're not part of the atom anymore. And so you just want to be constantly circling around and doing that thing. So that it's 100% right what you just said, Chris.
So this next question is interesting because it's kind of almost either an alternative look or maybe the next phase, which is back at the core. How can silos be broken down to get all employees to look at the very survival of the company as their challenge versus the survival of their particular silo? And if so, how can these internally, inherently selfish silos be broken so employees can focus on the greater good to benefit the long term?
So again, I mean, it points to incentives and how we incentivize and the KPIs that we are creating, that they actually point in a direction that is good for strategy and good for the organization, and hopefully also good for the world, and not just good for the silo. And what we see is that the most successful companies, when it comes to innovation, they work much more cross-functionally. They work much more across the different divisions and different sections of the organization, and have a much stronger diversity in their teams. So those are definitely important tools. Okay?
Yeah, I would say incentives for sure. It's these are all symptoms. Incentives for sure, but I would also say like the story's missing. And if you have to tell everyone what to do all the time, then there's something wrong, right? We should be all laddering up to something bigger that is clear but undefined as to how we get there. And that's that's usually, in my experience, been what keeps people from working together. And then the other thing is, when you're interviewing people, ask them questions about how they work. Not how they work across silos, but how they work. If you have a bunch of people whose default is to just like kind of work with whoever makes sense to work with inside the company, that's how they're going to work. If you work with somebody who's very, very, very much focused on their individual thing, this close up, which might be a good thing depending on what the project is, then of course you're going to get that. So both who you have on the team and then the organization and the platform they're coming into, that defines what you end up becoming. And it's always interesting to me that people just seem so surprised that the systems that they set up that were siloed and are siloed, that somehow people work in silos. If you look at their org chart, you're in silos, like literally in silos. How can you expect anyone to work differently? And then the last thing that I would say too is usually the problem starts at the very, very top. So these executives are there because they were naturally selected, to borrow Chris's allegory, naturally selected because they were so good at the old model, and then they became the apex of that thing. So then they get to the top and they have been reinforced and also bred into this position. And then they get to the top and the world is different than when they were, when that was the real thing. And they're told, you need to change. Everything needs to change. And they're like, I literally don't know how to do that. I have been naturally selected to be just as I am. Everyone around me is just as they are because of the system that brought them up. So then the only way to fix that is through story and bringing in other people that can break that mold for you.
And of course, I think also to add to that, and one of the reasons why I love seeing some of the old big companies starting to use KPIs such as collaboration or how much energy they have for the for the project that they're actually hired to do, etc., is because, I mean, you most likely will hire people who have a lot of experience from corporate world, and that means they have all this baggage with them regardless, right? So again, you need also to create a new system that they're actually able to adapt to, and creating these KPIs and doing them more qualitatively is, I mean, it's not easy to do, but it's simple, and it enables different storytelling, and it enables different conversations in the organization that can help you move in the direction that you need to do.
No doubt. Exactly right.
So we have just a few more minutes here, but there were quite a few questions across different industries. I think a lot of times people think Silicon Valley when they think innovation and these platform models. But in particular, a couple folks asked about service industries, like such as consulting or professional services, consumer goods. So how does this innovation model, or does it change? And are there some good examples of some organizations that are leading this innovation across those other types of industries?
I mean, so obviously, depending on the industry you are in, you sort of get hit, if you like, by digitization at different paces, right? So not everyone has felt this in the core of the organization at the same strength yet. I'm certain everybody will. I mean, retail, obviously, and you're the expert here, Kyle, has been in it for a while now. Consulting, I mean, what we see in consulting is increasing automation of services, right? And even what perhaps used to be the more complicated ones. And as artificial intelligence develops, and as the complexity, I think, of the world develops also, and the ability to keep track of whatever else is going on, I don't see any human consultants having actually the chance at all to thrive without, having the best coworker being an AI, at least.
Exactly. You're exactly right. I wouldn't add one thing. You're exactly right.
All right, we'll do one more. This question is back to storytelling. Is the hero's journey a good example to facilitate for success?
Kyle?
Yes, 100%. That's like Chris. This is if there was a church of Joseph Campbell, I might join. But yeah, it really is. And so, there's criticism of the hero's journey being a singular exercise versus a community, and I would disagree with some of that. But it really is. What I love about the hero's journey is that every single person, no matter where you're coming from, no matter what your background is, no matter how absurd it is that you would become the hero, you can become the hero. And what that means is that you're able to do what's in your destiny to become. And that sounds super corny, but no, everyone's talking about how the millennials really need purpose in their work. That is total garbage. Everyone needs purpose in their work. And it's either provided to them, or they imbue it into their work, or they hate their job and or leave. And so it's really up to us to understand these things, like in the hero's journey, like in Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, to really take these principles and then look at our lives and look at work, which is a part of our life, and to be able to see how that all comes together or doesn't. And I've always seen that whenever there's a mismatch, whenever you're unhappy in your personal life or your professional life, it's because you have either lost sight of what you're doing and what your journey is and the reason why you're going through this pain and suffering, or you actually aren't laddering up and actually working on your journey. So one of those two things is missing. But what's undergirding all of that is you should have a purposeful, dictated path for what you're doing ladders up to something bigger than yourself. That's joy, that's happiness. And we should also talk about that openly inside of organizations. And once again, the path is laid out for us, not in like self-help books, but in literary theory. And that's why these stories are so compelling to us. Like if you just think, like just take a step back, like, you know, when the aliens come down, one of the weirdest things about us is how much we are obsessed with stories. It doesn't really make any sense why we're so obsessed with stories. And it doesn't matter who you are, how much money you make. It doesn't matter how old you are. We're obsessed with them. And so we have to take what we know to be right in this hero's journey and literary theory and bring them into work. And I think that we're just at the beginning of that new management science of figuring that out and bringing that out. And it's not just for legacy companies. I mean, we can apply this to governments. And I will leave with this. I'll just say this. If you look at the global problems that are happening in the world, I think one of the core issues is that we have left a positive, opportunistic view of where we're going as a society, or as a global species. And we are now in this, I don't know. So then it becomes a zero-sum, get off my lawn mentality. So we need to get back to this big, ambitious futures of where humanity is going. Because that's when humanity thrives. You think about what happened after World War II in the late 40s and the 50s. If you look at the art and the things that people were producing globally, it was so optimistic. And then we were able to go to space in a very short period of time. Then we were able to create vaccines. Then we were able to create all kinds of magical things in a very short period of time after coming back from the Second World War. And we need to do that again. And so these storytelling things, sorry, I'm waxing philosophical. These storytelling things are not just cutesy little management things. They are who we are, and we can take that and we can use that. Read Joseph Campbell.
And I mean, so I couldn't agree more. And just to add a final touch to it, I think there's no way we will solve the really big, important problems in the world if we don't have the big companies taking a very active interest in doing so. There's a lot of business reasons for why that is a good idea, but really figuring out how to align your core purpose in the organization with solving some of these big problems in the world is massively important for the world. There's huge business opportunity in it. And again, we've talked a lot about incentives throughout this webinar here. It's massively incentivizing both for employees and customers to be a part of that journey.
That's a perfect way to end. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Kyle. Thank you, everyone, for being here and for all of your great questions. I apologize we didn't have time to get to all of them, but we've reached the top of the hour. We will send a recording of this webinar out shortly, and have a great rest of your day or evening, depending on your place in the world. Thanks, everyone.
Bye, guys.
Bye.